The boom was close enough to taste, a metallic shockwave that rattled Alistair's teeth. Dust, ancient and undisturbed for centuries, rained down from the high rafters of the throne room. Another boom. This time, the sound was wetter, the sharp crack of 10-foot thick oak beginning to splinter. She is a usurper. The voice of Lord Kale was a physical force, a roar of pure, reptilian dominance from the other side of the doors. The throne has rejected her. The bloodline is broken. Seize the pretender. 30 seconds, human. Queen Lyra's voice was the opposite, a ragged, terrified whisper that cut through the chaos. She stood 9 feet tall, a creature of majestic, scaled nobility, yet she was trembling. Her ceremonial crown sat crooked on her horned brow. 30 seconds, she repeated, her golden, slit-pupiled eyes fixed on him, or we both die. Alistair didn't look up. He couldn't. He was a xeno-biologist, a human prisoner captured on a survey mission. He wasn't a kingmaker. He wasn't a miracle worker. And he certainly wasn't a mechanic. The cold iron of his prisoner's manacles bit into his wrists, forcing him to angle his hands awkwardly as they flew across the interface of his own medical scanner. A piece of human tech so primitive, the Draconian guards hadn't even bothered to confiscate it. Now, it was the only thing holding back an army. He had its microsplicer jammed into a hairline crack in the Throne of Ascendancy. The artifact was supposed to be a living computer, a divine oracle, the source of all Draconic law. Right now, it was a 40-ton paperweight. It was cold. Dark. Silent. Come on, come on. Alistair muttered, his own sweat beading on his brow. The scanner was drawing power, but the throne's internal systems were a fortress. Boot sequence, bypass, anything. Crack boom. A massive, armored fist punched through the wood. Sunlight streamed in, illuminating the armored, three-clawed hand as it groped for the locking bar. Lyra let out a small, choked sob. It's not working. Alistair hissed, his mind racing. The diagnostic protocols were failing. The machine was actively refusing him. It wasn't broken. It was locked. Why? He whispered. What is it looking for? He switched tactics. This wasn't a repair. This was a diagnosis. He ran a blood matcher protocol, comparing the trace DNA on the throne's handrest against the ambient readings. The scanner beeped, and a single line of code flashed on its tiny, cracked screen. A line that made Alistair's blood freeze. Purity threshold not met. Reject. 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 He suddenly understood. Kale was wrong. The bloodline wasn't broken. Oh, gods, Alistair whispered, his knuckles white. Lyra misread his terror. It's hopeless. A jagged spear of oak, the size of a man, exploded inward, narrowly missing them both. The doors were collapsing. No, Alistair said, his voice suddenly numb with the terrifying revelation. He looked up at the 9-foot queen, the last of a 1,000-year dynasty, and held up his scanner. Your Majesty, the throne isn't broken. The problem is, you. 3 months earlier. The air in the royal kennels was thick with the smell of sulfur, ozone, and something acridly metallic that Alistair still couldn't identify. It was a stench of sickness. He knelt in the damp straw, his prisoner's tunic, once a standard-issue Endeavour science uniform, now just gray rags, soaked through. Before him, Kor, the old king's personal drac-hound, lay shuddering. The creature was a monster of slate-gray scales and coiled muscle, a predator that could bite a man in half. Now, its breathing was a shallow, wet rattle. It is the Shadow Blight, High Priest Vor intoned, his voice a gravelly rumble. He was a 9-foot wall of crimson scales, draped in chains and smoking incense. The beast's spirit is forfeit. Alistair said nothing. He was Doc, a title the Draconic guards used as a slur. He was the human, the ape-physician, a curiosity captured from a deep space survey mission. On a world that measured worth in wingspan and brute strength, his mind was a useless trinket. His wound wasn't the chains, it was the profound, soul-crushing waste. He, a man who held doctorates in xeno-biology and genetic engineering, was assigned to tend the court's pets. More blessed salts. Vor commanded his acolytes, who began chanting and forcing a smoking paste into the hound's jaws. Kor convulsed violently. Alistair saw it instantly, the blue-tinged gums, the pinpoint pupils. Cyanosis. Neurotoxin. Stop, Alistair said, his voice quiet but sharp. Vor froze, his slit-pupiled eyes narrowing. What did the ape say? You're killing him. Alistair ignored the guards, pulling his primitive human medical scanner from his belt. The tiny, cracked screen lit up. This isn't a blight. It's a paralytic agent. He aimed the scanner not at the hound, but at Vor's blessed salts. The device chirped. Compound match, hemlock variant. Active toxin. The silence in the kennel was absolute. You're poisoning him, Alistair stated, his voice flat. He didn't know if it was ignorance or malice. He didn't care. Insolence. Vor roared, raising a clawed hand to strike. You dare. I dare to do my job. In one fluid motion, Alistair pulled a pre-filled syringe from his medkit. A simple, human-made universal antidote. He has 2 minutes, maybe less. He ignored the guard's warning shouts and plunged the needle deep into the hound's massive shoulder. It was a desperate, spite-fueled act of competence. For 1 second, he wouldn't be invisible. The hound went rigid. The chanting stopped. Vor smiled, a cruel, reptilian expression. You have killed the king's favorite, human. Your end will be. Kor let out a gasp that was half a roar. His massive chest expanded, his limbs untangled, and his huge, golden eyes snapped open. The blue in his gums vanished. He took a deep, shuddering breath, then slowly, painfully, lifted his head and licked Alistair's chained hand. Vor's jaw hung open. The guards stared, their weapons lowered in confusion. Alistair had just performed a miracle the high priest had declared impossible. He countered the curse. The whisper came from the shadows. Alistair looked up, squinting. He hadn't realized they had an audience. Princess Lyra stepped into the dim light. She hadn't been watching Vor or the chanting acolytes. Her gaze was fixed, with a disturbing, analytical intensity, right on his scanner. You, she said, her voice quiet and sharp, a stark contrast to her father's roar. The invisible man. She took a step closer, ignoring the recovered hound. That device, it showed you the curse. Alistair stood, wiping his hands on his tunic. It showed me the truth, your highness. Lyra stared at him, her golden eyes seeming to peel back his skin. It wasn't the look of gratitude he expected. It was a look of sudden, cold calculation. What, are you? She whispered, not to him, but to herself. Alistair felt a chill colder than the stone floor. He had just saved the king's hound. But in doing so, he had just made himself visible to the one person who might be even more dangerous than Lord Kale. He had just become a tool. Lord Kale's voice was a low, satisfied growl that silenced the great hall. The Off-World Federation begs for trade rights, he sneered, tossing a human-made data pad onto the stone floor. It skittered and cracked. They offer us technology in exchange for our star metal. Why should we barter with apes for trinkets, when our strength allows us to simply take what is ours? The court rumbled in agreement. Alistair, standing in the shadows near the kitchens, invisible as always, watched the late king's consort. Kale was a purist, an arrogant mountain of black-scaled muscle who saw the galaxy in simple terms, predator and prey. And humans were, unequivocally, prey. Beside the ailing king, Princess Lyra sat perfectly still. She was the only one who flinched when the datapad shattered. Kale was her betrothed, a political alliance to secure his military backing. To Alistair, she was a figurehead already in a cage, her ambition simply to survive Kale's. That's why he was so terrified when she appeared in his cell, the dark, damp medical bay, later that night. "Your Highness," he stammered, scrambling to his feet. "If you are found here." "I am not here for medicine, Doc," Lyra's voice was a low whisper. She was cloaked, her massive 9-foot frame hidden in the shadows, her royal guards conspicuously absent. This was not a royal visit, it was a conspiracy. She was holding something. Another datapad. His datapad, salvaged from his ship. "The guards called this ape scribble," she said, her voice tight with a strange, desperate energy. "But it's not, is it?" She activated it. A complex, holographic star chart sprang to life, bathing the cell in blue light. "These are pathways. Your truth seer on the Hound was a scanner. This is a map. You mapped the heavens." Alistair was speechless. "It's a chart of FTL jump points. Standard survey data. They tell us the stars are the unblinking eyes of our ancestors," Lyra said, her voice laced with a bitterness that shocked him. "They tell us our magic is a gift from the void. You navigate the void like it's a river. You see it as data." She stepped closer, the light of the hologram playing over her scaled features. This was the vulnerable figure, trapped not by Kale, but by ignorance. Her world valued tradition so much it had forgotten how to think. "I am surrounded," she whispered, "by 9-foot warriors, priests, and politicians. And not a single mind. Not one." In that moment, Alistair understood. He wasn't her prisoner. He was her only window. This wasn't just a conversation, it was an escape. A bond formed, not of affection, but of intellectual starvation. She was the only Draconian to see him as a person. He was the only person on the planet who could see her, the brilliant, trapped mind beneath the crown. "What else, Alistair?" she pressed, her voice hungry. "What else does your science see?" He hesitated. This was dangerous. But he was a scientist, and this was the first real question he'd been asked in months. "It sees patterns. In everything. Weather. Biology. Genetics." Lyra went very still. The air grew cold. She shut off the star map, plunging the room back into near darkness. "Lord Kale speaks often of the purity of the bloodline," she said, her voice barely audible. "The old texts speak of the ancestors' law, a sacred code the Throne of Ascendancy must verify." She turned, her golden, slit-pupiled eyes finding his in the dark. "Tell me, Doc." She whispered, a new, terrifying suspense in her voice. "This scanner of yours. The one that saw the truth in my father's hound. What would it see, if it looked at Draconic blood?" The funeral pyre of the old king had barely cooled. Its smoke, thick and smelling of spiced oils, still hung in the rafters of the great hall, a physical shroud of transition. The entire Draconic court was present, a sea of black, crimson, and bronze scales. Every noble, every priest, every warrior, stood in rigid silence. Alistair watched from the deepest shadows of the rear colonnade, invisible as ever. This was the moment. The inciting incident he had unknowingly been a part of. At the front of the hall stood the Throne of Ascendancy. It was not a chair. It was a monolith, a single, massive piece of obsidian-like precursor metal, humming with a latent power that made Alistair's teeth ache. Its surface was carved with runes that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. It was a cold, sleeping titan, and its only purpose was this, to verify. High Priest Vor raised his staff. "The breath of the father has passed. We now seek the blood of the daughter. Let the Throne of Ascendancy judge. Let the oracle speak." "Princess Lyra, no," Queen Lyra, by right, stepped forward. She was magnificent, her ceremonial armor of black and gold gleaming. She walked with a confidence that seemed absolute, every inch the named heir. But Alistair saw it. He saw the tiny, almost imperceptible tension in her jaw. He saw the way her claws were clasped just a fraction too tight on her scepter. He remembered their secret, whispered conversation. What would it see, Doc, if it looked at draconic blood? She wasn't just curious. She was afraid. Lyra reached the dais. The hall held its breath. This was the public validation, the unshakable center of their entire culture. She was the named heir, this was just a formality. She raised her hand, magnificent and steady, and placed it firmly on the throne's designated handrest. And, nothing. Just, silence. A profound, absolute, and impossible silence. The low, latent hum of the throne did not swell. The runes did not flare with the golden light of acceptance. The air did not shimmer with the divine blessing. The monolith remained exactly as it was, a cold, dark, and utterly dead piece of metal. Lyra's confidence didn't crumble, it shattered. She pressed her palm harder, a flicker of raw, animal panic in her golden eyes. She tried again, shoving her hand against the sensor. Nothing. A single, collective gasp sucked the air from the room. It was a sound of pure, unified shock. The whispers started instantly, a sibilant, venomous tide. It has rejected her. The bloodline is broken. Imposter. Alistair's blood ran cold. He wasn't watching a failed miracle. He was watching a machine fail to authenticate a user. A machine that was looking for a specific genetic key. Lyra stood frozen, her hand still pressed to the silent artifact, her public execution complete. And then, the sound of a single, slow clap echoed from the side of the hall. Lord Kale stepped out from the ranks of the nobility. He wasn't sneering. He was smiling. It was a smile of pure, patient, triumphant malice. He hadn't been watching the throne. He had been watching Lyra. Well, Kale's voice boomed, cutting through the whispers and silencing them. It seems we have a complication. He drew his ceremonial blade, the sound of steel on leather deafening in the still air. The Throne of Ascendancy has spoken. And it has declared that we are without a queen. Lord Kale's smile was a venomous, triumphant slash across his black-scaled face. He hadn't just been waiting for this, he had expected it. The blade in his hand, a jagged piece of volcanic glass, wasn't pointed at Lyra. He pointed it at the silent, mocking throne. The throne has spoken, his voice boomed, a parade ground roar that hammered the stunned court into submission. It finds no air. It finds a lie. He turned on Lyra, his grin fading into a mask of righteous fury. For 10 generations, the blood has been pure. Now, it is broken. She is a pretender. Kale, no. Lyra's voice was strong, but it wavered, her authority vanishing like smoke. Silence, he roared. He wasn't her consort anymore. He was her judge. He slammed the pommel of his blade against his own chest plate. Clang. 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 It was a signal. From the alcoves and side doors, the city guard, his city guard, emerged. They weren't wearing the royal gold, but Kale's own crimson and black. Their heavy, spurred boots echoed on the stone as they formed a perimeter, not around the queen to protect her, but between her and the court. They weren't her guards. They were her jailers. Alistair shrank back, his heart hammering. This wasn't a political crisis. This was a coup. The speed, the precision. Kale had this plan down to the second. Kale stalked forward, his massive form eclipsing Lyra. He snatched the ceremonial scepter from her hand and tossed it aside. It clattered, loud as a thunderclap in the terrified hall. You have disgraced the ancestors, he hissed, loud enough for the entire court to hear. You have brought a lie into this sacred hall. But I am merciful. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that only Lyra, and Alistair, straining in the shadows, could hear. You knew, didn't you? Your secret visits to the ape. You were looking for a way around this. You knew you were flawed. Lyra's face went white. He knew. He knew. Cale straightened up, his public mask of command back in place. I, Lord Cale, as defender of the Ascendancy, give this pretender 1 hour. He pointed his blade at the great hourglass near the hall's entrance. 1 hour to prove the bloodline that the throne itself has denied. 1 hour to perform a miracle that our ancestors have forbidden. He smiled. And if you cannot, you will be taken to the judgment spire and executed for high treason. The stakes slammed into place, no longer personal, but brutally public. Her life. Her crown. And, as the nobles began to shout, some in fear, some in support of Cale, the fate of the entire kingdom. Civil war was no longer a threat, it was a promise. Take her, Cale commanded. 2 crimson-clad guards seized Lyra's arms. She didn't fight. She was in shock, a queen one moment, a dead woman the next. As they dragged her from the dais, her terrified, golden eyes scanned the crowd, past the snarling nobles, past the loyal to Cale guards, and locked onto the shadows where Alistair hid. It wasn't a plea. It was a silent, desperate command. The clang of the heavy iron bar sliding into place on her chamber door was the sound of her world ending. It was followed by the dull thud of a spear butt against the wood. By order of Lord Cale, a guard's voice, her guard, Captain Malek, a man who had served her family for 20 years, called out flatly. The pretender is secured. The betrayal was a cold, sharp blade in her gut. She was a prisoner in her own chambers. Lyra, Queen of the Ascendancy, stood alone in the sudden, suffocating silence. The great bell from the judgment spire tolled across the city. Clang. The first quarter hour. She had 45 minutes. Cale thought he was clever. He had her trapped. He had her guards. He had her title. But he was a soldier. He thought in straight lines. He had forgotten that this castle was ancient, and she had been exploring its secrets since she was a hatchling. She ran to the far wall, to the massive, woven tapestry of the first ancestor. She didn't pray. She grabbed the tapestry's heavy iron hem and pulled, revealing the cold, dark stone behind it. 3rd stone from the left, 5th from the top. She pressed. A low, grinding groan of stone on stone echoed in the room. Lyra froze, listening. Outside the door, the guards' heavy boots were silent. They hadn't heard. A black, man-sized hole opened in the wall. This was the valley, the crawlspace, the dark, the humiliation. She was a queen, reduced to scuttling through the castle's guts like vermin. The passage was tight, her armor scraping against the stone, the air thick with dust and the smell of ages. She wasn't just running for her life. She was running to a life. Alistair. The man who fixed things. Alistair, meanwhile, was doing the exact opposite. He was breaking things. He was frantically smashing the few pieces of draconic medical tech in his bay, creating a scene. Forced entry. A struggle. Ape-physician killed while trying to escape. It was a flimsy alibi, but it was all he had. He just saw a coup. He knew the protocol for loose ends, and the invisible human who had been asking the queen questions was the loosest end of all. He was stuffing his medkit and scanner into a waste disposal chute when a grinding sound came from the wall behind him. He froze, his blood turning to ice. They're already here. The stone panel slid open. Alistair stumbled back, his hands raised. Queen Lyra near fell out of the passage, her golden armor streaked with grime, her crown gone. She wasn't a queen. She was a desperate, 9-foot refugee. Your Majesty, he stammered. You can't be here. They'll kill me anyway, she hissed, her voice a low, ragged sob. She seized the front of his tunic, her claws digging in, lifting him slightly. The power dynamic was gone. This was pure, high-pressure desperation. You said it yourself, she panted, her golden eyes burning with a terrifying, calculated light. You called it a sequencer. You said it was waiting for something. She knew. She'd understood. They all think it's magic. A divine judgment. Her voice broke, just for a second. Kale thinks I'm flawed. She shoved him back, not in anger, but to point at his med scanner, lying on the table. But it's not magic, is it, Doc? She whispered, the challenge, the plea, the gamble, all in one. It's a machine. You fixed my father's hound when their magic was killing it. You see the truth. You understand their code. She took a shuddering breath, her entire kingdom, her entire life, balanced on this one impossible question. Can you fix the throne? This way, Lyra commanded, pulling Alistair not toward the main door, but back into the shadows of his own medical bay. He'll have the main passages locked down. Kale's a soldier, he only knows the arteries. We will use the veins. She plunged her claws into the wall by the waste disposal unit, finding seams Alistair had never noticed. With a groan of ancient, grinding stone, a section of the floor slid away, revealing a spiral staircase descending into absolute darkness. The great bell tolled. Clang. 30 minutes, Alistair whispered, his scanner's chronometer providing the truth the bell only approximated. The tunnels were not built for a 9-foot queen. They were tight, ancient, and slick with a dampness that smelled of cold metal. Lyra had to crouch, her ceremonial armor scraping and echoing in the confined space. Alistair was right behind her, his med scanner providing the only light, a weak blue-green cone that barely cut the oppressive dark. Where are we? He panted, his voice sounding small. The old ways, Lyra said, her voice tight. The parts of the castle Kale's purists are forbidden to walk. Forbidden? Why? Lyra stopped, her massive form completely blocking the passage. Because, she whispered, they are not ours. She pointed his scanner light at the wall. Alistair squinted. The stone here wasn't carved, it was seamless. It was a cold, dark, unknown alloy. He ran his fingers over it. This wasn't a castle's foundation. This was a hull. This whole place. Alistair breathed, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. It's not a castle. It's a ship. It's our home, Lyra snapped. Keep up. A sudden, rhythmic thud-thud-thud from above forced them back against the cold metal. A ventilation grate, just above their heads, showed a slice of the main hull. A patrol of Kale's Crimson Guard, their armored boots marching in perfect, terrifying sync, passed by. Lyra and Alistair were pressed together in the suffocating dark. He was pinned against her, his cheek against the cold scales of her arm. He could feel the thrum of her alien physiology, the slow, powerful thump-thump of her heart, and the fine tremor of fear running through her. The queen was gone. The prisoner was gone. They were just two partners, two heartbeats in the dark, united against the bootsteps above. The patrol passed. They moved on, finally reaching a rusted bulkhead. This is it, Lyra said. The maintenance passage to the great hull. She pushed. The door didn't budge. It's sealed. Rusted shut. No, Alistair said, his scanner already analyzing the seam. It's locked. Hydraulic. Stand back. He jammed his multi-tool into a diagnostic port he was probably the first to see in 5,000 years. This is going to make a noise. He didn't have time for subtlety. He reversed the polarity, shorting the ancient mechanism. With a high-pitched screee of tortured, dying metal, the hydraulic seals blasted open. The door groaned, scraping on the floor. "There!" Lyra grunted, shoving it open just wide enough to slip through. They spilled out from a hidden panel, emerging directly behind the Throne of Ascendancy. The great hall was empty, the huge hourglass near the entrance almost drained. Boom! 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 The sound wasn't from their tunnel. It was from the main doors. Kale's forces had arrived. "They're too late," Lyra panted, her eyes on the doors. "They're right on time," Alistair yelled, grabbing the massive iron crossbar, a log of metal as thick as his body. "Help me!" They both seized it. With a combined, desperate grunt, they lifted the bar, slamming it into the heavy iron brackets, sealing the doors. They stood, heaving for breath, for one single second. Wham! A massive, armored impact struck the door from the other side, making the iron bar jump in its cradle. "Open this door. In the name of Lord Kale." The hunt was over. The siege had begun. Wham! The iron crossbar jumped in its brackets, a visible shockwave of force. The sound was no longer a fist, it was a battering ram. "They're using the siege ram," Lyra said, her voice impossibly tight. She drew her ceremonial blade, a long, elegant curve of metal and gemstone. It was a beautiful, useless symbol against the raw physics of the log smashing against the door. 5 minutes. Maybe less. 5 minutes, Alistair echoed, his voice hollow. He wasn't looking at the door. He was at the throne. He ran his hands over the cold, seamless surface. Okay," he muttered, his mind racing. He was talking to himself now, the adrenaline singing in his veins. "It's not magic. It's tech. All tech needs an interface. All tech needs power." The High Priest chants, Lyra offered, her back to the splintering door, her blade held ready. "He anoints the handrest with sacred oils. He's wiping off the grime so the scanner can get a clean read," Alistair replied, his own scanner whirring, its blue-green light playing over the exact spot Lyra's hand had been. "It's a biometric reader. Standard. But it's offline. The whole system is in standby." Wham! A crack, a spiderweb of light, appeared in the thick oak. "It has to have an access panel," Alistair shouted, half in panic, half in frustration. "It's a machine. It has to be serviced. It is a sacred monolith." Lyra yelled back. "It was given by the ancestors. It doesn't have panels." "It does." Alistair was on his knees, running his scanner along the base, pushing aside 1,000-year-old cushions. "It has to." His scanner let out a sharp, high-pitched chirp. "There." It was a rune, indistinguishable from the hundreds of others carved at the base. But his scanner showed a faint seam. "It's a bolt head," he whispered in disbelief. He fumbled for his human-made multi-tool, flipping through the attachments. "No, it can't be." It was a standard 10mm hex. The absurdity of it, that this divine, precursor artifact was held together by the same bolt as a piece of IKEA furniture, was staggering. He jammed his tool into the slot. It fit. With a click that was deafeningly small and a hiss of decompressing atmosphere, a section of the obsidian monolith slid open. Lyra gasped, her blade lowering. Inside, there was no magic. There was a server rack. Crystalline processors, humming with a pale blue light, were submerged in a bath of clear, bubbling coolant. Thick, bundled wires, more like arteries, snaked down from the rack into the very floor of the castle, into the hull of the ship below. The heart of the ancestor," Lyra breathed. "It's a mainframe," Alistair whispered, his eyes wide with a scientist's awe. This was precursor-level tech. He had never seen anything like it. Crack boom. The door was breaking. "Alistair." He ignored her, jacking his med scanner's cable into a diagnostic port. The tiny, cracked screen lit up, and Draconic code, no, precursor code, flew past, a language he shouldn't know, but it was based on math. He could read it. "It's not broken," he said, his voice flat. He turned, his face pale. "Your Majesty, this isn't an oracle. It's not a judge." His scanner beeped, the final diagnostic complete. "It's a lock," he said, his voice numb. "A highly advanced genetic sequencer. And it's not broken at all." He held up the scanner. A single line of text flashed in the alien language, but his device had translated it. "Status, awaiting key. Genetic marker 1 alpha. No match found." "It's not broken," Alistair repeated, the blood draining from his face as the ram outside prepared for another strike. "It's waiting. It's waiting for something that you don't have." Wham! The iron bar bent, a sharp, metallic groan of protest. The doors were failing. "It's waiting for a key." Alistair yelled over the din, his face illuminated by the console's blue light. "A genetic marker. Something in the royal bloodline. Then test it," Lyra commanded. She didn't wait. In a move of pure, regal desperation, she gripped her own ceremonial blade, reversed it, and sliced the razor-sharp pommel across her scaled palm. Dark, crimson-black blood welled up instantly. "Here," she snarled, thrusting her bleeding hand at him. "Blood. The blood of the kings. Test it." Alistair didn't hesitate. He grabbed her hand, a human holding the bleeding fist of a queen, and pressed his med scanner's intake port directly to the wound. The device whirred, drawing a sample. Wham! A huge chunk of the oak door exploded inward, spraying the room with fist-sized splinters. "Analyzing," Alistair muttered, jamming the scanner back into the console. His tiny, cracked screen was now the brain for a billion-dollar precursor computer. Comparing sample to Ancestors Key database. The console, which had been a cool, passive blue, flashed a deep, violent crimson. A single, brutal line of text appeared on Alistair's scanner. "Genetic match, 99.99%. It's you," Alistair said, a wild, confused hope in his voice. "The match is perfect. It is you. Then why?" Lyra screamed as the doors outside fell silent, the terrifying, sudden calm before the final breach. "Wait." Alistair's eyes scanned the next line. His blood ran cold. "Error, safeguard 10.4 violated. Purity exceeds threshold. Purity exceeds." He whispered. "What does that mean?" "Alistair." Lyra shook him, her claws digging into his shoulders. "They're coming." It's a failsafe," Alistair breathed, his mind racing, connecting dots he didn't even know existed. Their secret conversations, her fear about the purity of the blood. Kale's obsession with it. He ignored Lyra, his fingers flying across his scanner's interface, digging into the console's deep code. He wasn't a mechanic, he was a biologist. He was looking for safeguard 10.4. And he found it. It wasn't a law. It was a protocol. A quarantine. A note from the precursors, buried in the code for millennia. "My God," he whispered, stepping back from the console, his face a mask of horrified awe. The shouting, the ram, all of it faded. "What, Alistair? What?" "They were scientists," Alistair whispered, looking at Lyra as if seeing her for the first time. "The precursors. They weren't just giving you magic. They were managing you. As a species." He pointed a trembling finger at the screen. "Safeguard 10.4. To prevent critical genetic stagnation, recessive trait lock, and the eventual collapse of the species, an out-of-species genetic marker is required every 10 generations." Lyra stared, her mind refusing to process the words. Out of species. Crack. The iron bars snapped in two. The doors began to swing open. Your Majesty, Alistair said, his voice hollow. Kale is wrong. You're not illegitimate. He pointed at her, at the Queen, at the result of 1,000 years of arrogant, deliberate inbreeding. You're too draconic. Your purity isn't your strength. It's the reason you're locked out. Kaboom. The siege ram's final, splintering impact was an explosion of sound and matter. The great oaken doors, the pride of the ancestors, bowed inward, a galaxy of cracked spiderwebbing from their center. The iron crossbar, bent into a smoking U shape, was all that held. 30 seconds, human. Lyra's voice was a ragged shriek. We were back. Caught up to the cold open. But now, Alistair knew why. 30 seconds. He panted, his eyes locked on the console's glowing, mocking text, error, purity exceeds threshold. The choice was laid bare, as sharp and brutal as Kale's blade. Choice 1, do nothing. Let the door fail. He would die, executed as a heretic ape. Lyra would die, dragged to the spire as a pretender. And Kale, the arrogant, purist, xenophobic warlord, would seize the throne. The planet would drown in a pure, civil war, tearing itself apart, all because of a genetic typo. All because their pride had made them rigid. Choice 2, the ultimate hack. Alistair looked at the console. He couldn't rewrite precursor code. It was a mountain. He was an ant. Trying to change Safeguard 10.4 was like trying to rewrite gravity. But he was a human. Humans didn't break mountains, they tunneled through them. They didn't fight gravity, they used it. And he was a biologist. I can't rewrite the law, he whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying, sudden clarity. But I can satisfy it. Wham! The doors splintered. Light streamed in. Alistair. Lyra screamed, raising her useless blade. It requires an out-of-species marker, he yelled back, his fingers flying across his own scanner's interface. It's a lock, and it's looking for a key. We don't have one. Yes, we do, he roared, jabbing a finger at his own chest. I'm human. I am, by definition, out of species. He couldn't change her blood. But he could change what the machine thought her blood was. His med scanner held his own complete profile, stored for diagnostics, specimen, Alistair.m.Gray. Species, human. Federation standard. It was a genetic forgery. The ultimate heresy. He didn't hesitate. He isolated Lyra's file, lyra.k.dracos, authenticating. With a drag and a tap, he hacked the sequence. He created a new, hybrid profile, splicing his human file directly into hers. Processing. The console's crimson error light wavered. Kaboom. The doors disintegrated. They exploded inward in a cloud of dust, smoke, and splintered oak. Blinding daylight flooded the ancient hall. Silhouetted in the ruined archway stood Lord Kale, his black scales untouched, his jagged blade resting on his shoulder. Behind him, a dozen Crimson Guard soldiers fanned out, their weapons gleaming. Kale's reptilian grin was one of pure, absolute victory. The hour, he boomed, is up, pretender. Alistair's scanner beeped. Out of species marker detected. Safeguard 10.4, satisfied. Processing, awaiting final authentication. It's done, Alistair breathed, his hand still on the console. Kale's smile faltered. He hadn't seen the console's light. He hadn't seen the hack. He just saw the human and the usurper, cornered. Seize her, Kale commanded, his voice flat and cold. And kill the ape. The hour, Lord Kale boomed, his voice echoing in the ruined hall, is up, pretender. He was magnificent in his triumph, a 9-foot god of black scales and cold iron, silhouetted against the blinding light of the shattered doorway. His crimson guard fanned out, their weapons sharp and ready, a perfect, disciplined half-circle. The coup was over. This was the execution. "Seize her," Kale commanded, his voice flat. "And kill the ape." The soldiers surged forward. Alistair flinched, his hand still on the console, his entire body screaming run. But Lyra didn't run. She didn't plead. She didn't draw her useless blade. She simply stood. Pale, her armor grimed, her royal authority in ashes, she took one, single, shuddering breath. Then, with a resolve that seemed to come from the very stones of the castle, she turned her back on Kale. She ignored the guards' hands reaching for her. She ignored the blades. She walked, with a slow, deliberate, resolute pace, the final 3 steps to the Throne of Ascendancy. A final, pathetic prayer. Kale sneered. "It has already rejected you." The first guard reached her. His 3-clawed, gauntlet hand was just inches from her shoulder. Lyra placed her hand, the one that had failed her, the one that wasn't bleeding, flat onto the obsidian handrest. Click. It wasn't a sound of magic. It was the sound of a deadbolt. A microsecond of impossible silence fell, a void where even the dust motes seemed to freeze. Kale's smile faltered. Then, it was not a sound. It was a feeling. A deep, subsonic hum that vibrated from the floor, up their bones, and into their teeth. "What?" Kale whispered. Alistair's med scanner, still plugged in, screamed as it was overloaded with a torrent of power. A single, blinding beam of golden light erupted from the console, not as a glow, but as a concussive wave. It slammed outward, a physical force of pure, technological acceptance. The first 2 guards were thrown backward, skidding on the stone. Kale roared, shielding his eyes as the light washed over him, pure and hot. The throne sang. The thousands of runes carved into its surface, dormant for a generation, flashed to life, burning with a golden fire. The air itself shimmered with heat. The light receded, but it didn't vanish. It coalesced, flowing into Lyra, bathing her in a divine, technological aura. The soldiers, who had been charging, stopped. Their weapons wavered. Thud. The guard closest to her, the one who had tried to seize her, dropped to one armored knee. Thud. 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 Like a shockwave, one by one, Kale's crimson guard, his army, his purists, fell to their knees. Their loyalty wasn't to a dragon. It was to the throne. And the throne, in a language of fire and thunder, had just spoken. Kale's face twisted, the arrogant mask shattering into 1,000 pieces of disbelief. "No," he choked. "No. It's a trick. The ape, the human did something. I command you. Seize her." Not a single soldier moved. They were kneeling, heads bowed, in absolute submission to their queen. His coup hadn't just failed. It had been erased. How? Kale shrieked, his voice cracking, the warlord replaced by a panicked, confused child. What did it say? The golden light faded from Lyra. The runes on the throne dimmed to a steady, confident glow. She stood taller. The fear was gone. Her eyes, blazing with an alien, terrifying new power, did not look at Kale. She turned, her gaze sweeping past the kneeling army, past the broken lord, and locked directly onto the invisible human still clutching his med scanner. How? Kale's shriek was a pathetic, cracked thing. The warlord was gone, his power evaporated. He was just a confused, furious creature, staring at his kneeling army. What trick is this? The human, the ape did this. What did it say? He was appealing to his soldiers, but they were deaf to him, their heads bowed to the divine will of the throne. The throne itself gave the answer. The blinding golden light that had engulfed Lyra didn't fade. It settled. The thousands of runes on the monolith dimmed from a raging fire to a steady, confident glow. But the light from the console, the one Alistair had hacked, remained. A single, shimmering thread of golden data, like a metaphysical umbilical cord, still visibly connected the throne's core to the med-scanner in Alistair's hand. He tried to drop it, but the light clung to the device, a visible, undeniable link. The Queen turned. Her new power was a physical presence in the room, an ozone-like stillness. Her golden eyes, now blazing with an alien, terrifying, and ancient authority, did not even glance at Cale. He was a ghost. He was already dead. Her gaze swept past her kneeling army and locked directly onto the invisible human still clutching the scanner. Alistair felt his blood freeze. This was not the look of gratitude he'd expected. It was the same look from the kennels, when he'd saved the hound. It was not friendship. It was not relief. It was calculation. It was ownership. Lord Cale asked how. Lyra's voice boomed. It was no longer the whisper of a girl, but the amplified, resonant projection of the throne itself. The sound seemed to come from her, and from the very stones, all at once. He asked what the oracle said. She raised her hand, not in anger, but in proclamation, and pointed one long, black talon, directly at Alistair. A new, horrified silence fell. The kneeling soldiers looked up, their faces a mask of confusion. Cale's face, already pale, went ashen with a sick, sudden understanding. "The human," a soldier whispered, his voice thick with revulsion. "The throne accepted my bloodline," Lyra declared, her voice a final, ironclad judgment, by binding it to his. The word binding hung in the air, cold and heavy as a chain. "The ancestral law is absolute," she continued, her eyes never leaving Alistair. "The precursor's failsafe, the out-of-species integration, has been met. The purity is satisfied, by him." Alistair's med-scanner, still trapped in his hand by the golden thread of light, chirped. A new, official-looking file appeared on its cracked screen, uploaded from the throne. Title: Prince Consort. Species: Human, Key Gene. Status: Locked. He was no longer invisible. He was no longer a prisoner. He was something new. He was a tool. He was a key. Lyra turned her gaze to Cale, her first act as a true queen. "He," she said, pointing to Alistair, "is the kingmaker. And he is now, mine." Cale's eyes went wide, the final twist of the knife. He, the purest, had been defeated by the one thing he despised most. "I am the queen," Lyra declared. "And the throne has chosen its king. Take him." Lyra's voice was flat, the divine, amplified echo of the throne already gone. The Crimson Guard, his own men, did not hesitate. They seized Lord Cale, whose blade had clattered uselessly to the floor. Cale was in shock, his black-scaled face a mask of disbelief. But as they hauled him, he was processing. The warlord's mind was still working. The human. He choked out, his eyes darting from the throne to Alistair. The out-of-species marker. The fail-safe. His hate-filled eyes locked on Alistair. And in that instant, the hatred was eclipsed by a sickening, profound recognition. He didn't just see his victor. He saw his own stolen plan. He knew, Cale whispered, the realization sucking the air from his lungs. He found it. He found it first. Cale had been hunting for a human, a pet, or a prisoner, to use as his key. He had been planning to force this very hack to secure his own claim after Lyra's failure. Alistair, the invisible ape, had beaten him to it. "You stole it." Cale roared, a final, pathetic lunge, not at the queen, but at Alistair. "It was mine." The guard slammed him back, dragging him, screaming, from the hall. He wasn't a failed usurper. He was a failed thief. The throne room emptied with a dreadful, shuffling silence. Nobles, priests, and soldiers filed out, their faces a confused, awestruck medley of fear and revulsion. They cast one last look at the queen, and the thing that was now, somehow, bound to her. The ruined doors groaned in the wind. The silence was absolute. Alistair was still holding the med scanner. The golden, shimmering thread of light that connected him to the throne snapped off, like a switch being thrown. He dropped the scanner. It clattered, the sound like a gunshot in a vast, empty hall. He looked at Lyra. She was still standing by the throne, her back to him. The 9-foot-tall queen, who had just faced down an army, began to tremble. Her shoulders, held with such impossible, regal stiffness, slumped. She leaned a hand against the cold, dark metal, as if for support. She turned. The divine authority was gone. Her golden, slitted eyes were wide, alien, and terrified. Alistair. Her voice was a whisper. The girl from the cell. You saved me. She stalked toward him, not like a queen, but like a predator approaching something it couldn't understand. But, what does this mean? She pointed a shaking talon at the scanner, then at the throne. Genetic. Consort. The word was a foul, alien taste in her mouth. What did you do? I did what a human does, he stammered, holding up his hands. I cheated. He explained it all. The fail-safe. The precursors, genetic management. The purity that was slowly killing them. The 10th generation out-of-species marker. I couldn't rewrite their law, he finished, his voice small. So I forged the key. I spliced my human DNA into your authentication file. She stared at him, her chest rising and falling. She slowly, so slowly, reached up with her uncut hand. Alistair flinched. Her 3-clawed, scaled hand, surprisingly warm, gently, touched his face. A gesture of profound, alien curiosity. You bound yourself to me, she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion he couldn't read. To save my life, you changed your genetic signature to my bloodline. An act of ultimate, unforgivable heresy. He braced for the blow. Kale would have made you a slave, she said, her eyes searching his. The law says you are my property. She took a small step back. But I will not make you a prisoner. Her regal bearing returned, but it was different now. Stronger. You are the kingmaker, Alistair. He let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. But now. She whispered, the terror returning to her eyes as she glanced at the ruined doorway. What do we tell them? The nobles will demand a union. The law will demand an heir. Alistair realized the truth. He hadn't just saved her. He had trapped them both in a new, more impossible prison. He was no longer Kale's prisoner. He was the throne's. The great hall was a sea of hate. Days later, the throne room had been repaired, but the kingdom was more broken than ever. Every noble from every house was present, their 9-foot-tall frames crammed into the pews. The air was thick with a low, collective hiss. And it was all directed at Alistair. He sat not on the throne, but on a small, hastily prepared chair at its base. The prince consort. The ape king. The abomination. The blood is tainted. High Priest Vor's voice boomed, striking a ceremonial gong. The traditions of 10,000 years, shattered by a creature. The throne itself is compromised. The throne is awakened, Lyra's voice cut through the din, amplified by the artifact she now sat upon. But her power was new. It was brittle. The nobles were not yet cowed. Bring in the prisoner, a noble from the back benches roared. The side doors opened. Lord Kale was dragged in, bound in chains of iron. He was bruised, his scales dull, but his eyes were still fire. He was their martyr. You see? Kale roared, his chains rattling. You see what she has brought us to? I gave her a chance to prove her purity. And she chose this. He spat at Alistair's feet. This, vermin, has poisoned the well. He has polluted the blood of the ancestors with his filth. The purity law is all that protects us from them. A roar of agreement. Lyra gripped the throne's arms. Her newfound authority was crumbling. Alistair stood up. The hall fell silent. The sheer audacity of the human standing was an insult. He was tiny. He was soft. He looked, to them, like a half-formed meal. He was terrified. But he was also a scientist. And he was angry. He didn't argue politics. He didn't make a speech. He walked past Lyra, pulled his primitive med scanner from his belt, and, in an act of ultimate, unforgivable heresy, plugged it directly into the console of the Throne of Ascendancy. The court exploded. Heresy. Desecration. You speak of purity, Alistair's voice said. But it wasn't his voice. It was amplified by the throne, booming with the same ancient power as Lyra's. You speak of tradition. Let me show you the price of your tradition. A massive, golden hologram flared to life above the court. It wasn't a law. It was a chart. House Voltar, Alistair's amplified voice declared. A powerful, bronze-scaled noble in the front row went pale. 14 hatchlings in the last cycle. 8 stillborn. Whispers. House Krell. 20 hatchlings. 4 with shadow blight. Dead within a year. House. Vor, Alistair said, his eyes landing on the high priest. Your own grandniece. Born, without scales. The high priest staggered back as if struck. You call it blight, Alistair's voice hammered them. You call it a curse. You sacrifice to the ancestors for a cure. He projected the data from Safeguard 10.4. The precursors called it inbreeding. This isn't a curse, you arrogant fools. It's a recessive trait lock. Your purity is genetic stagnation. You aren't being protected. You are dying. The hall was dead silent. He didn't just argue. He presented autopsy reports. The precursors knew this would happen, Alistair continued, his voice softening. They knew your pride would be your doom. So they left a key. A fail-safe. Not an impurity. A salvation. He unplugged his scanner. The hologram vanished. Lyra stood. The silence was absolute. The purity law, she declared, her voice ringing with final, unshakable authority, is hereby abolished. It was never a law. It was a suicide pact. She looked at Alistair. This era of silence is over. A new institutional policy begins today. We will call it the Precursor's Gambit. An era of alliance. An era of change. Kale, defeated, was dragged away, screaming, "You've doomed us all." Alistair, shaking, finally let out his breath. He'd won. The science had won. He looked down at his scanner. A new, private message from the throne had just appeared on its screen. It wasn't public data. It was a new protocol. File, Consort Protocol 1B. Status, active. Objective, generate viable hybrid heir. Timeframe, 1-1, gestational cycle. Alistair's blood ran cold. The institutional problem was solved. The personal one had just become a terrifying, biological ticking clock. 1 year later. The Great Hall of the Ascendancy was unrecognizable. The air, once thick with the smoke of incense and wood fires, was now clean and bright, circulated by silent, human-designed atmospheric processors. The flickering torches were gone, replaced by glowing, precursor blue light, channeled by Draconic, mystics, and human engineers from the reawakened ship core below. The first human embassy was established. The alliance was fragile, but it was real. Draconic strength, allied with human ingenuity, had created a new, burgeoning prosperity. At the front of the hall, Queen Lyra sat on the Throne of Ascendancy, which was no longer a simple seat of judgment. It was the radiant, humming hub of a planet-wide network, its console now attended by a mix of robed Draconic priests and human technicians in Federation jumpsuits. Beside her, in the new, custom-made, consort's chair, sat Alistair. He was no longer Doc, the invisible ape-physician. He was Prince Consort Alistair Grey, his title spoken with a new, grudging respect. He wore no crown, no armor. He wore a simple, dark, human-style uniform. And on his belt, where a Draconic noble would wear a blade, he wore his med scanner. Today was the unveiling. The past year has been difficult. Lyra's voice, no longer amplified by the throne but by a subtle human-made microphone, was warm and resonant. We have faced our past. We have faced our pride. We have learned that purity is a prison, and alliance is a key. She nodded. Let the new age be recorded. Two massive tapestries were pulled away from the wall opposite the throne. The court, a new court, a mix of Draconic nobles and human ambassadors, let out a collective, hushed gasp. It was the new mural. The legacy symbol. It depicted Queen Lyra, 9 feet tall, magnificent, her golden eyes blazing with power. In one hand, she held the scepter of state, the symbol of her ancient royal power. And at her side, not a 9-foot black-scaled warlord, but a 5'10" human. His face was resolute, his eyes fixed on the future. In his hand, held with the same reverence as the scepter, was not a sword, but his small, primitive, med scanner. The mind and the might. The Ape King and the Dragon Queen. The new sigil of their new, hybrid world. The ceremony ended. The hall slowly emptied. Finally, it was just the two of them, standing in the silence, gazing up at their own, towering legacy. It's bigger than I expected, Alistair said, his voice small in the vast hall. Lyra let out a sound, a short, sharp bark. A Draconic laugh. It is truth, Alistair. They needed to see it. They needed to understand what saved them. Her voice softened. The alliance is strong. The shadow blight, as they called it, the genetic stagnation, it's in full retreat. Hatchling mortality is down 40%. The science, Alistair nodded, was sound. The public legacy is secure, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. She put her warm, scaled hand on his arm. He knew what she was asking. He looked down at his med scanner. It was his badge of office, permanently linked to the throne. A single, private message icon had been blinking in the corner. Not for a day. For a week. He had been too afraid to open it. He tapped the screen. File, Consort Protocol 1B, status, pending. Objective, generate viable hybrid air. His breath hitched. But there was a new line. One that hadn't been there a year ago. The precursor AI, after a year of being networked with a human, had learned. Query, genetic compatibility, confirmed. Query, biological imperative, confirmed. Query, awaiting. The AI had added a new, final, and utterly human word to its protocol. Consent. Alistair looked from the blinking word on his screen, to the massive mural of the Kingmaker, and then to the vulnerable, 9-foot woman standing beside him, waiting for his answer. The Kingmaker's choice wasn't over. It had only just begun.